Warning, the Savage Nation contains adult language, adult content, psychological nudity. Listener discretion is advised. And now, the world's most exciting podcast, The Savage Nation, home of borders, language, culture. And here he is, New York Times best-selling author and National Radio Hall of Fame inductee, Michael Savage.
Welcome to the free version of the Michael Savage podcast, and I'm going to keep it free for all of you. But there are many of you who would love to be able to listen to my show without any ads. I love ads, but many of you want to listen to the podcast free of ads. So we created something for you, a solution. We call it the Savage Premium. For less than the price of one flat, tasteless beer at your local bar, you can receive access to all of my podcasts going back years, ad-free for just $3.99. That's it, $3.99 a month. You'll get not only my ad-free podcast, but you will also occasionally receive access to material that is exclusive for members only, and I'm going to give you the list in a minute of what you've missed. You're going to get an occasional monologue from me, maybe a reading from one of my novels, sneak peeks of interviews before anyone else hears them, archive pieces dating back to 1994. Many things that come up, you're going to get exclusive access to Michael Savage material. Details can be seen on my website, michaelsavage.com, and if you want to join, all you got to do is go to glow.fm and search Savage Premium. That's glow.fm and search Savage Premium. Now, you will always have access to my free weekly podcast. I want to be clear about that. That's my promise to you. But if you want less ads and more Savage, join the Savage Premium Club today and never miss a spoken word of mine. It's glow.fm/Savage Premium. You can find it on michaelsavage.com. And here's some of the stuff that you have missed so far. Michael Savage reading from his best-selling novel, Countdown to Mecca. My words, my voice. Savage reads from one of his lost journals, Fiji, 1968. Savage's first drive time show, Hour One. My interview with the Jewish gangster, very popular. I read from my first written, published article, Who Was at the Helm, from 1965. It's heard nowhere but on my premium site. I read passages from my novel, Abuse of Power. We replayed Fat Al's Tuna. My Savage show from 3/24/94, the earliest show in the archive, 3/24/94. My interview with Donald Trump from 1/10/2011. 1/10/2011, while Mark Levin was mocking him and Sean Hannity was mocking him and the others were mocking him, I was interviewing Trump. Much more. And remember, subscribers also get ad-free podcasts every week. The cost is less than a beer at a bar, and you get a better buzz with the Savage Premium. So go to glow.fm/Savage Premium for full access to ad-free podcasts and exclusive sound you'll not hear anywhere else. Thank you very much. Welcome to the Savage Nation podcast. You're going to listen to Colonel Douglas McGregor in a moment here with Michael Savage. We talk about a lot of things, and I want you to remember one thing. Colonel McGregor led the 2nd Armored Unit in Iraq in the Battle of 73 Easting. It was the U.S. Army's largest tank battle since World War II. And this man, Colonel McGregor, is the author of 5 books. He has a Ph.D., and he was commissioned in the regular Army in 1976 after only 1 year at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and 4 years at West Point. In 2004, McGregor retired with the rank of colonel. In 2020, President Trump appointed McGregor to serve as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, a great post he held until President Trump left office. Then, of course, he was fired by Biden. Colonel McGregor holds an M.A. in comparative politics, a Ph.D. in international relations from the University of Virginia. He's widely known inside the U.S., Europe, Israel, Russia, China, and Korea for both his leadership in the Battle of 73 Easting and for his groundbreaking books on military transformation, which are called Breaking the Phalanx and Transformation Under Fire. Hi, Colonel McGregor.
Hi, Doctor. How are you?
Love seeing you again. You're the only one standing up for peace in the whole world right now. I never saw any. It's like a rush to insanity everywhere I turn.
Yeah, it's depressing.
Mm.
I don't think most Americans are in a big rush to go to war with anybody. I think we have to limit our comments to the people in Washington.
But the American people, it never even became an issue during the midterms, Colonel. That's the part that struck me as extremely troublesome. Here we are engaged in a foreign war, supplying weapons unlike, I would say in 50 years, I've never seen anything like this. Long-range artillery, which was just unleashed on Russia, and we're supposed to believe that we deactivated the long-range capacity of these long-range missiles. I don't believe it. Do you?
I have no way of knowing.
Okay. Well, you would know more than I would.
Well, the problem is that war, at least over the last 30 years, has always been something that happened on someone else's soil. And that's a huge problem for people in the United States. They do not have a fear of war because war doesn't seem to touch them. Mm-hmm. And I think the second thing is that even though these wars that we were involved in, certainly over the last 20 years, were enormous failures, strategic failures, they didn't involve Americans to the extent that anybody at home paid that much attention. You know, everybody's prepared to believe, well, you know, it's not their fault. The politicians did this. And we're really the greatest. And they kind of walk away.
Colonel, look, let's just back up if we can for a minute. You are being criticized on many fronts by people who seem to be invested in war making, the machinery of war, and such. You know, you're a warrior. You commanded a huge tank group in Iraq. You won the Battle of 73 Easting, the U.S. Army's largest tank battle. So you're not a paper tiger. You're not one of these guys who just sits there and talks about war without knowing what shells do to people. And here I am, a civilian, a student of history. So I watch History Channel almost all the time. And one of the things I'm rewatching is Apocalypse World War I. Mm-hmm. I can't stop watching it because the level of horror is hard for a civilian to imagine. That millions of men died, and it started out as an almost accidental war with first one country did this, then the other country did that, then that country joined that one. And there are parallels. We don't have men dying in trenches here, but there are Ukrainians in trenches there because of the situation. Russians are dying in the tens of thousands. So there are men dying on the battlefield, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And the Ukrainians are doing most of the dying by a huge margin.
Now, Colonel, I need to ask you about that because I've never seen a time that a side celebrates killing the other person's men with such vigor and glee, or makes jokes about it like the Zelensky crowd, like they lit a cigarette and it went up. What kind of statements are these?
You know, Dr. Savage, it's very hard to understand how the people sitting in Kiev arrived there.
Okay.
It doesn't make any sense. We can go back to 2012 and 2014 to the so-called Maidan revolution and how we manipulated things. But this is worse than black comedy. You hear of people that come out of nowhere. Zelensky had most of his theatrical troupe come with him and pick up cabinet positions in Kyiv. And all of a sudden, he's running a country and he's driving hundreds of thousands of troops into battle on the assumption that I guess they're going to win. And, to make your point about World War I, it's a very important point because everyone was convinced that the war, however many people joined it, would not last very long. Mm. And if you go back and read over the comments made about the Russians at the beginning of this war, they were ridiculous. Oh, the Russians are incompetent. The Russians are stupid. The Russians don't know what they're doing. The Russians are losing thousands of men. The Russians are running out of ammunition. The Russians are running out of missiles. The Russians are running out of everything. And the Ukrainian victory march seems to have begun almost immediately on the 24th of February. Now, they finally admitted publicly that, at least over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed
How many? They've admitted that 100,000
yes.
Ukrainians have been killed?
Oh, absolutely. Men? Yeah, you had, what's her name? Ursula von der Leyen, the leader of the EU, president of the EU. She made a speech, and she admitted that over 100,000 Ukrainians had been killed in the war.
All I've seen is how many Russians were killed and that the Ukrainians were doing well. So
no,
now
they've never done well. This is the big lie. This is the lie from day one.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians have started killing them at about a 1-to-3 ratio. Then it moved up to about 1-to-5, then to 1-to-8, and right now they're killing them at 1-to-10.
That's how many Ukrainian men are being slaughtered
for every Russian
in this meat grinder.
Oh, absolutely. And all of these counterattacks that the Ukrainians have been launching for the last several months are virtually manna from heaven for the Russians.
Why? Because
the Russians were very astute. They decided that, and this is something most people don't understand, they decided finally after 3 months, I think, of really believing that there could be a negotiated settlement, decided this was not going to happen. And so we know that they had meetings at the very top with the Stavka, the general staff. And the general staff, of course, was always very, very skeptical that any negotiated settlement could be reached.
Now, wait, I want to follow you. You mean the Russians or the Ukrainians?
No, the Russians.
Okay.
The Russian general staff was always skeptical. But Putin was convinced that the right show of force and the readiness to negotiate would produce a negotiated outcome. Because remember, their goals at the outset were actually quite modest. All they wanted was Ukraine to become neutral, to stay out of NATO. That was number one. Number two, they wanted autonomy for the two so-called breakaway republics.
And don't put nuclear missiles on our border with Russia.
Of course not. Yeah,
that would be like telling Mexico or our Cuban missile crisis, you can't put nukes in Cuba.
Right. Exactly the same. And then finally, recognize that Crimea has really always been Russian. It's never been Ukrainian. It's been Russian since the 1770s when the Russians threw out the Tartars and the Mongols that ran the area. And I think Putin made the mistake of assuming that there were reasonable people in Washington, D.C. or in Kiev. And instead, he discovered that not only were we not going to negotiate, we were going to do everything in our power to remove him from government and essentially to destroy the Russian state and effectively dismember it at some point.
Are they going to be able to do that? Because, I've heard Colonel McGregor, I keep seeing this madness of destroy this nation called Russia, dismember this nation called Russia, defang this nation called Russia, make Putin go away. This is what I've heard from Hillary Clinton, by the way, in my reading, started the ball rolling on this anti-Putin madness. Why does the American left-wing establishment in particular have such a vendetta against Russia? This I don't understand.
Well, Dr. Savage, you're an expert on left-wing ideology, and you're the one that's been telling us for years that they're all mentally ill. I can't improve upon that description.
Well, I'm trying to laugh in the face of a nightmare here because, when you realize the people running the country may actually be mentally ill and that their mindset is so narrow focused on destroying a nation state that is not going to be destroyed, and that we risk nuclear war with them, it makes you wonder, is there no one screaming for peace? Now, I remember about 3-4 months ago, Henry Kissinger came out and called for peace talks.
In my view, the movement towards negotiations and negotiations on peace need to begin the next 2 months or so. The outcome of the war should be outlined by them before it creates upheavals and tensions that could be even harder to overcome.
He was called every name under the sun. Old, senile. Of course, Biden's not old and senile. But Kissinger, who wanted peace, is old and senile.
Yeah.
Michael Savage, a host like no other.
Hey, Savage listeners, I want to tell you about Kachava, my team's daily super blend. If you're like me, trying to stay on top of your health and get all your nutrients, then please listen because Kachava has you covered. Kachava puts everything your body needs in one glass. All the superfoods, all the protein, all the greens, all the vitamins, all the omegas, all the benefits for your brain, your gut, your skin, your muscles, your heart, your whole health. No more compromise, no more guilt. No other nutritional shake does all this. They travel to the ends of the earth to source all the most powerful superfoods, and they crush them up. It's so simple. You take 2 scoops of powder, you add water, you blend it up, and you enjoy it. You're going to be surprised how good it actually tastes. My team drinks Kachava for breakfast, and they tell me they have energy all day long and they feel great. You've got to go try Kachava for yourself. Right now, they've got a special offer for my listeners. Go to kachava.com/savage. That's Kachava, Kachava, Kachava.com/savage. You're going to get 10% off your first order. That's Kachava.com/savage. In the last few days, we've seen 3 explosions at major Russian bases, one of them just 150 miles from Moscow. So the war is being brought to Putin's doorstep. What's going to happen next, Colonel?
Well, what we're waiting for right now is once this decision in the summer was made to change the whole mode of operation, to move Ukraine out of the category of the so-called special military operation and treat Ukraine like a war zone, there began an enormous buildup of Russian military power. Remember, when the Russians went in, they never used more than 20% of their ground force. They had strict orders to avoid killing civilians, avoid injuring civilians, don't destroy infrastructure. Finally, Putin said, this is not going to work. And he brought his general staff in and they said, we're going to have to wage war. And Putin said, well, I want to end this war. And they told him, well, if you want to end this war, then we're going to have to do things very differently. So what you have right now is a buildup all around eastern, southern, and northern Ukraine of a force that is now probably 550,000. It's going to approach over 600,000 before they're through.
What, Russian men?
Yes, Russian troops. But more important than the numbers are the systems that are being employed. They've moved up all of their modern military systems, their strike systems, their Iskander missiles, their cruise missiles, their rocket artillery systems, thousands of them. And they have something that we had in 1991 that they now also have down to the lowest level, and that is precision. The microcircuitry that guarantees that when you fire a missile and it lands 500 miles away from you, that it will actually hit the target that you aimed at. They've got that now. They have as much precision as we do. In fact, I would describe the current set of circumstances as 2 men sitting across from each other playing chess. And they're looking at each other's boards, and everybody knows what the other person has. There are no secrets. So it's a different kind of warfare from what we've experienced in the past. And now all of the things that everyone can see are instantly targets. So he appointed a new commander, and he said, I'll give you whatever you need. You can use whatever you want, excluding nuclear weapons. There will be no nuclear weapon use. Putin's made that very clear repeatedly. So he can now use whatever capabilities are at his disposal. He will have hundreds of thousands of troops. And what he's done is said, before we attack, I want to minimize any loss of Russian life. So we are not going to attack until the conditions inside Ukraine are conducive to success. And what you're witnessing about every 2 or 3 days are massive precision strikes by hundreds of missiles and rockets and artillery systems that are designed to do several things: destroy Ukraine's air defense system, destroy its communication system, destroy its power grid, destroy its transportation infrastructure, eliminate ammunition storage, oil storage, fuel storage, and so forth.
Isn't this what we did against Saddam Hussein before Bush went in?
Of course, we did exactly the same thing. We did the same thing to the Serbs during the Kosovo air campaign.
I remember
And
that.
by the way, this is what we did to Germany, and we did much worse, obviously, to Japan. for very, very different reasons. I mean, every Japanese house was made of wood and paper, so it was very difficult to avoid these fires. But we did essentially the same thing to Germany, and we did it to Iraq, and we did it to the Serbs during the Kosovo air campaign.
When we in World War II, to go way back, and this is not way back, it's actually recent history compared to way back history, which you're much more aware of than I am. When we firebombed Dresden, Dresden was largely a civilian target that was meant to instill terror and fear in the German population, or were there, in fact, munitions factories mixed in Dresden? Do we know?
No. Dresden didn't have any military significance or importance, and I think we're dealing with a certain amount of mendacity on the part of the British at the time. But I wouldn't want to be distracted by that, because that's still being debated.
Oh.
And there are lots of people characterized the Royal Air Force at that point, and Churchill and the leadership of the Royal Air Force as war criminals.
Wow.
For having done those things. So I don't want to get dry. Look, when we landed at Normandy, we pulverized the entire region. We killed 60,000 Frenchmen. No one ever talks about it.
Wait, in Normandy prior to landing?
Yes. So again, this is the world before precision. Today there is precision. So there is no need for collateral damage in most cases. And when you do see some collateral damage, and I've been looking at these photographs of damage in Kiev, some of the larger cities in Ukraine, it's very clear that many of the Ukrainian air defense missiles, when they strike a target, or sometimes they miss it and it breaks up, the missile falls on whatever happens to be below it. And in most cases, that's a civilian population. Now, naturally, the Ukrainians immediately point the finger at the Russians and say, well, the Russians did that. It's malicious. It's not true.
That was 3 weeks ago when they tried to start World War III by saying Russia launched into Poland, correct?
Exactly. Utter nonsense. I would say that 80% of everything the Ukrainians accuse the Russians of, the Ukrainians are guilty of doing themselves.
Well, that sounds familiar, but how does, you raise the issue of these highly sensitive, very accurate cruise missiles, for want of a better phrase, that the Russians are using. Yeah. They're cruise missile type of missiles.
Well, the drone, we call it a drone. It's effectively a smaller cruise missile.
How does Zelensky avoid getting assassinated if they are that accurate?
Because President Putin has decided not to do that.
Why, in your opinion?
I think he wants someone that he can talk to at some point. Even if he finds Mr. Zelensky unattractive and unappealing, he still wants someone in Kiev to talk to.
Isn't that something? So we keep hearing reports about, for months, and I didn't believe a word of it. Putin crapped in his pants. Putin has MS. Putin has Parkinson's. Putin's dying. Putin's hand is shaking. The marks on Putin's hand mean that he was under an IV. He grabbed a desk. I knew it was all propaganda. It looked like childish propaganda to me. In your opinion, what is the truth about Putin's health?
Well, to be frank with you, I don't know.
Well, that's an honest answer from a warrior.
Yeah, if I had ground truth, I'd share it with you. I don't, but for someone who's been dying now for months, he looks pretty good.
The Savage Nation. It's Savage on Demand.
Hey, will a lack of a red wave during the midterms lead to a more emboldened Biden? More wasteful government spending? Higher taxes? How will you protect your hard-earned savings from the reinvigorated left? The answer, gold. Gold is the world's oldest, most proven form of currency. It's there for you when inflation soars, when other assets go sideways. And that's why Birch Gold is so thrilled to introduce a new product that reimagines gold as currency, the Goldback. This month, you'll get a free Goldback for every $5,000 purchased when you convert an existing IRA or 401k into a precious metals IRA with Birch Gold by December 22nd. Birch Gold will help you own gold and silver in a tax-sheltered account. Text SAVAGE to 989-898 to claim your free info kit on gold. Then talk to one of their precious metals specialists. Plus, with every purchase you make before December 22nd, you'll get a free Goldback. This is a great stocking stuffer, just in time for Christmas. Once again, text SAVAGE to 989898. Protect your savings with gold today and get a free gold back. Once again, text SAVAGE to 989898. Protect your savings with gold today. So, the current intelligence coming out of the Kremlin, we don't know much about his health. We know that there are some leaders calling for peace, daring to break free of this blockade of any alternate opinion on the war. And whenever they speak out, they're called agents of Putin, correct?
That appears to be the modus operandi. Anybody who dares to suggest that we ought to talk to the Russians and bring this tragedy to a close is immediately attacked. I'm sure you saw that General Milley, who is hardly someone that I would express any admiration for, but he did have a meeting in the Oval Office and suggested, quote unquote, to the president and whoever else was with the president at the time, that the Ukrainians had probably accomplished all they possibly could. And thus it was probably a good idea to negotiate with the Russians. Well, he was immediately shot through the chest verbally and told out of the question. We have no intention of talking to Putin.
Was that Blinken and the State Department did that to him?
I really don't know. I'm sure that Sullivan was in there.
Oh, boy.
But I don't, and maybe people working for him, but beyond that, I have no idea. But the bottom line is that within 24 hours, he was back on the air and he completely recanted and contradicted what he had said previously.
Sounds familiar.
So we know that the Ukrainians have no chance in hell of winning. They are in bad, bad shape. We think the Ukrainian force right now is about 194,000. And large quantities of it consist of light infantry. They've long since run out of tanks and their heavy guns are worn out and they haven't been able to maintain a lot of the equipment. Most of this really complex and sophisticated equipment like your HIMARS rocket systems are maintained and operated by Westerners under contract.
We have special forces operating on the ground, don't we?
Sure.
But we're told that we're not there. But it's clear to me that we have men on the ground for quite a while now. We're not just training them in England. We're in that war on the ground, sort of the same way American forces were advisors in the beginning of Vietnam.
Yes, I think that's a legitimate comparison.
Well, it doesn't get any better. It gets worse. You send in advisors. The next thing you do is you send in ground troops. So if the Ukrainians are able to use our weapon systems to reach very close to Moscow, what's to stop the Ukrainians from taking a big gamble and firing a nuclear weapon at Russia?
Well, first of all, they don't have a nuclear weapon. They don't have warheads and they don't have missiles to deliver them.
But Poland does, don't they?
No, the Poles don't have anything either. The only people with that capacity right now in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are the United States, Great Britain, and France. No one else has that capability.
But Great Britain's being very gung-ho about war with Russia. They seem to be cheering it on.
It's beyond belief. It's hard to imagine why suddenly overnight everyone in Great Britain utterly hates and despises Russia. It doesn't make any sense.
I don't understand where this came from. You know, I'm a very simple person in some ways. I'm very loyal to friends. I remember when Trump was president. I remember cheering when ISIS was wiped out of Syria by a combined effort of the United States and Russian air forces. That's when I started to cheer. After Obama had enabled ISIS to run rampant over those areas, raping and pillaging and murdering and destroying great art, suddenly I see Russia and the United States cooperating, using combined air force power and basically decimating ISIS. And I said, this is a great thing that we are watching. How the hell did this get reversed so quickly, where Russia became our enemy?
Well, you have a cabal of people that were in the Bush administration that then showed up under Obama, grew stronger, remained there through Trump's time in office because he never thoroughly purged the bureaucracy, nor did he exercise great care with regard to the people he appointed. So they survived the Trump years and they've come back with a vengeance. I mean, you can trace most of the people at the top of the Biden administration pushing this back to the people that brought you the interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo.
Oh, I remember those days. They were some of the darkest days in my radio history, watching Bill Clinton commandeer the United States Air Force, paint NATO markings on the airplanes, and watching our men bomb every bridge over the Danube River, and reading about Serbs looking up and saying, we haven't seen enemy planes bombing our capital city since the Nazis bombed us in World War II. What happened? They said we were allies of the U.S. Air Force in World War II. We rescued U.S. airmen behind enemy lines. How did this happen to us? And it was Bill Clinton and the neocons, if we want to use a very primitive phrase, who did this to the Serbs and then carved an entire piece of Serbia away that had been with them, a part of Serbia since the 13th century. As you well know, the history of the area. I was the only one in the media literally screaming from the rooftops. Again, not that I was looking for credit for it. I was only one commentator, but we're watching it happen all over again.
Well, that same group was interested in not only harming Serbia, but they were already talking in terms of what they could ultimately do down the line to Russia. They saw themselves as the vanguard of some bizarre, quote unquote, democratic revolution that was going to sweep all the way to Moscow.
Oh, here we go.
I was there. I was part of that. I saw it. It was very strange. And the sad part was that we didn't really need to bomb or kill anybody, because a lot of people don't understand this. The Germans were very opposed to all of this. And the German government was willing to spend billions of, at that point, marks and then euros to effectively build new settlements, new housing, new towns and cities for the various peoples in order to facilitate a painless and peaceful disengagement or separation.
We're talking about Serbia now?
Yes, no, for Serbia, for Bosnia-Herzegovina, for Kosovo. In other words, fine, the Serbs don't want to live with the Kosovars here, the Albanians don't want to live with them there, and so forth. Fine, we'll fix this. We'll spend the money. We'll give them new settlements, new areas. They can redraw these lines, and we can avoid a war. And I thought at the time, I was a witness to it, I thought it was a brilliant idea, made a lot of sense. And just so that you understand how gut-wrenching this was for many Europeans, the night that Belgrade was bombed, I watched a German general with tears in his eyes, who essentially turned around and pointed to the senior military leadership of the United States and Britain and said, you realize that we thought NATO existed to prevent another war in Europe. And now you've chosen to do this on the anniversary of our greatest sin. So there was by no means
unbelievable. The U.S. Air Force literally had their markings. I remember it was Secretary of Hate, Madeleine Albright, the psychotic who worked for her, Jamie something or other, was married to a Christiane Amanpour. I'll never forget those days. They were glowing about our planes dropping bombs and destroying every bridge on the Danube River. It was not reported, by the way, in the American media. The blowing
there were 23 bridges over the Danube, Doctor, and only 3 of them had any military value at all.
And we
destroyed them all
in order to cut off Serbia.
Well, it was to cut off the northern part of Serbia from the rest of it.
Well, it was
a bizarre event.
So we're watching a repeat what you're saying to me as you're the historian, you're the warrior. You commanded a huge tank division. How many tanks were under your command?
Now, I was at the time I had 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns. I was a major, and it's an interesting story. I wrote a book called Warrior's Rage, which recounts the whole thing. And it's an interesting story because I was the operations officer and I ended up leading it. And it was a brilliant performance by American soldiers. It was probably one of the best, I think, and certainly the 20th century may have been one of the best performances in the history of our country. And that's really why I wrote the book about it. It's well worth reading, and it explains what happened.
Now, is this the Battle of 73 Easting under another title?
Yes.
And what was it? What was the title of the book?
Warrior's Rage.
Well, I've got to get that.
The generals didn't like it because they wanted somebody to say that they had done all these marvelous things and won the war. And that wasn't true. And what I really wanted to recount was how brilliant soldiers can be if they are properly led, trained, equipped, especially if their leaders are at the front and lead them from the front. The American soldier is just about invincible.
Colonel McGregor, I have to go back to your war experience and where you are today. You're not a typical peacenik who's against war.
No.
I think what you are, if we could categorize you, as a man of peace who knows what war is. And what we're watching in front of our eyes is a slow motion disaster that's getting worse, not better. Since you were last on this podcast, I believe we could safely say that Ukraine has been roundly decimated, way beyond what it was at the time. What are there, 6 to 8 million Ukrainians have left the country?
Yes, and more are leaving now. The entire country is effectively blacked out.
Where are they going?
Well, they're marching west, although 2.5 million so-called Ukrainians have gone to Russia, but in most cases, those were Russians living in Ukraine. But you have another, as you pointed out, 7 or 8 million Ukrainians that have just moved west, and surprise, surprise, Western Europe is overwhelmed. They've just been through this mass migration out of Africa and the Middle East. Now they're dealing with a mass migration out of Ukraine. All of this comes at a time of severe economic crisis and downturn. I mean, if you were asking a question, what can we do to destroy Western civilization? I'm sure someone would approve this plan.
That's sarcastic and well said. It's as though the enemy within has found a way to destroy itself. It seems suicidal to me.
The Savage Nation. It's savage, uncut, unfiltered, and raw.
Again, I go back to this apocalypse World War I, and I see parallels. Great powers stepping in to escalate, not de-escalate. Anyone who speaks out is called a friend of Putin, an enemy of America. You've got cheerleaders like Sean Hannity and others in the media who are sitting there cheering for more war, calling themselves conservatives. How the people are so gullible to not see through this, I'll never understand. You know, it's bad enough when you have warriors calling for war, but when you have people who've never been in war calling for war, that's another story. How do they fan the flames of hatred like this and have a media machine behind them like Fox News?
Well, I asked in my graduate studies and much of the work I did in my life, I would ask some of these questions. And a German pointed out something to me that really resonated strongly. He had lived through all of it. And he said, it's very easy to persuade people to hate in the plural. He said, especially if the plural is somebody they don't know.
Hate in the plural.
They've never met. And I think, unfortunately, Americans have been through this before. And as we discussed it early part of this broadcast, they think war is something that only happens on someone else's soil. They don't see war as coming here. What they do not understand is that, first of all, we're not dealing with insurgents with rifles, running around in sandals up and down alleys. We're not dealing with an Arab army that, while pretty good by Arab standards, was certainly no match for a modern Western army. We're not dealing with a weak opponent. We're dealing with Russia, which for reasons of geography and resources that are abundant and food supply and energy is virtually an invincible fortress.
Invincible. Now, of course,
yes.
You and I talked about it's well documented part of history. Russia waited for this winter to emerge. We're only in the beginnings of a winter. Winter's not even really begun in that region. It's going to become more ferocious by the week. And Russia's been waiting for winter to do most of its fighting.
Yes.
What do you estimate is going to happen by February with this winter coming on in Ukraine?
Well, I think that I would imagine before February, it might come at the end of December, but there will be massive offensive operations launched from the north, launched from the east and from the south that will end up annihilating the Ukrainian forces that are left.
Oh, boy.
And the Russians are then probably going to table an agreement and say, these are the new borders, and this is where we stay, and we're not leaving. And I suspect that Russia will end up with everything east of the Dnieper River, which historically has been Russian anyway. And that's where most of the Russian speakers and culturally Russian people live. I don't see Ukraine surviving. As you rightly point out, it's already a destroyed country. It's a failed state. Its society is ruined.
It's ruined.
All because Washington thought that they could fight this war to the last Ukrainian and in the process would harm or destroy Russia. Russia is now extracting and exporting more oil and gas than it ever has in its history.
More.
Yes.
More.
It had a peak last week. And the Russians are swimming in cash. They're never going to run out of food.
What about ammunition?
Run out of energy.
We kept hearing they were running out of ammunition. They had to buy it from North Korea. Was that more propaganda?
I haven't called my friends in North Korea to find out, but I can tell you that I doubt it. If there's one thing the Russians don't seem to have a shortage of, it's ammunition and tanks and missiles. I know that their factories that produce missiles and ammunition, as well as armored fighting vehicles, are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Where are they? Up in Siberia?
Well, they're all over the country. And Russia is on a war footing for all intents and purposes. And in addition to the 300,000 reservists, they had 80,000 Russians volunteer.
Volunteer?
Yes.
We never hear about that. We hear about men running away from the draft.
Yeah. Well, what can I say? I was in a discussion yesterday with someone who's an anthropologist. And he pointed out, war can do one of two things to any great nation. It can tear it to pieces. It can undermine its self-confidence. It can ruin the society. Or, he said, it can strengthen national identity. It can promote greater social cohesion. And he said, if you look carefully at what's happening right now, Russia is stronger in the national sense than it's ever been. The population is overwhelmingly supportive of the fight. In fact, they're angry that the Russian military has not already crushed Ukraine out of existence. Putin actually spends a lot of time moderating the rhetoric, moderating people's feelings.
He's sort of the liberal of the Politburo, isn't he?
Well, if I'm not sure liberal's the right word, but he's one man who knows something about the West. And the sad truth of the matter is that he has always tried to cultivate a better rapport with the West. The man wants to do business with us. He's not interested in going to war. And of course, you have this strange dichotomy. On the one hand, everybody tells us for months the Russians are incompetent, incapable, they can't do anything. On the other hand, if we don't fight them, they're going to conquer Europe. Well, make up your mind. What are we dealing with? Which one is it?
Right. Are they invincible and on the warpath, or are they incompetent?
But the truth is they're neither. They want to be a normal nation. Now, what we have done is we have now forced them to essentially reevaluate their goals. And I think as a result of this experience, you're going to end up with a Russian military establishment that is infinitely larger, far more lethal and capable than anything we have seen.
Well, we see that Russia is, I'm reading so many different sites on this issue, and it says Russia cannot become a democracy. Russia plans to blackout blitz Ukraine into surrender. Blackout blitz. Is that where they're going? A blackout blitz?
That's already happened. They're already blacked out. And they know that the Ukrainian government, we're not talking about the population now, this man Zelensky and his friends, are going to sit there and say no as long as Washington tells them to. So they are resigned to offensive operations to root out and destroy what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces. That'll be on both sides of the river.
So what I'm hearing from you is that there will be eventually a settlement. Once it becomes untenable for Ukraine to continue, they will be forced to negotiate with Russia. Is that?
Well, I think also our European allies at some point are going to stand up and say enough is enough. I mean, now setting aside the Poles, who are charming people but hopeless romantics that seem to think that somehow or another they can profit from Ukraine's destruction and expand Poland and regain territory that they controlled when they were a kingdom in 1795. Perhaps that will work for them in some way, but the rest of the Europeans are looking at this and they see this as a terrible tragedy that's having a terrible impact on them. And once it gets colder and the winter wears on and the shelves are empty and people aren't getting enough to eat and they can't heat the water in their homes, let alone their homes, I rather suspect the Europeans are going to say, we don't care what the Americans want. We want an end to this. And I think that's coming.
I wonder why we haven't seen it yet. I used to, in a dark mood, say that when the winter comes, the Germans will be burning their grandmother's mahogany furniture if this keeps up. Well, they're not too. What are they burning for?
Well, they're burning a lot of wood, as you know.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Doctor, sometimes in order for things to change, they've got to get a lot worse.
Do you think it will get worse?
Yes, I do.
How so?
I think economically, it's going to get a lot worse. Germany is effectively being deindustrialized.
What?
Remember the lifeblood of their scientific industrial base, which is, essentially the foundation for prosperity in the European Union. They're the giant in the room. If you were to sort of, for analogous purposes, if you walked into a room with members of the EU, everyone would be 4 to 5 feet tall, and then there would be this person standing in the corner that was almost 7 feet tall. That's the German. So the Germany is on the path to deindustrialization because the natural gas was the lifeblood, cheap energy of the scientific industrial expansion that's been going on in that country for 30 years or more.
The natural gas from Russia, of course.
Yes, absolutely. And everybody has been complaining about this, saying, well, you can't do business with the Russians. But the truth is, with the exception of the 2 world wars, you go back to the last 300 plus years, the Russians and the German-speaking people did great business together and were very comfortable. In fact, in 1914, Russia's top business partner, economic partner, was Germany, and Russia was Germany's top business partner and economic partner. The same thing was true in 1941. I actually interviewed a man, he's long since passed away. He was a German company commander who captured a Russian train that was coming into Germany with timber, coal, iron ore, and at the same time, there was a German train that he had to stop that was loaded with machinery, farm implements, production machinery for tools that the Germans were shipping to Russia. This has been going on forever, and it makes sense. But people refuse to live, I think, in the 21st century. The 21st century is not the time for people to dig up whatever they didn't like in 1795 or 1850 or 1910 and uses as an excuse to justify military action against their neighbors. But there are so many people in Eastern Europe with agendas, Doctor. It's unbelievable. And that's another problem. The Poles have an agenda. The Lithuanians have an agenda. The Estonians, the Latvians, the Romanians. Everybody's got an agenda. And that's why Orban is disliked, because Orban has simply said, no, we're not going to participate in this disaster. This is going to destroy Ukraine. He's right. It will. Nothing good will come of this. And Russia is not interested in conquering Eastern Europe.
Home of borders, language, culture, the Savage Nation.
How much of this war is being used as a camouflage to cover up the Biden, I don't know how to put it, corruption? I hate to use a word that's so overused. With Hunter Biden and the deals with the energy company. Do you think that is what's keeping the Biden administration from working out a peace deal, is they don't want anything exposed?
I think there's more to it. The left is in power. The left wants to stay in power. And they're prepared to do almost anything to stay there. I think really you have to look at people like George Soros and Carl Schwab and others in the World Economic Forum. And those people are dedicated to the destruction of Russia.
Oh, God.
They're devoted to it. They're the ones that are behind most of the policies that anyone who has any common sense opposes. I mean, they're trying to deindustrialize us. Look what they've done to the oil and gas industry, the energy industry.
Yes.
Any attempt to repatriate industries back to the United States or
invest heavily in manufacturing, particularly high-end manufacturing, is being halted.
We've given Ukraine about $100 billion so far. Do we know the number?
Well, somebody told me the other day that while in reality, or let's put it this way, in theory, we've spent over $69 billion to arm, equip, assist Ukraine. Only about $20 billion of that cash has actually reached Ukraine, because most of the cash that pays for the military assistance and the equipment is simply transferred to the Pentagon to compensate the Defense Department for all of the ammunition and equipment they're shipping, also to pay the contractors who are sending over former U.S., British, whatever soldiers to work in Ukraine. And at the same time, that cash then is used to buy replacement equipment that comes out of the United States defense industry. And the defense industries, of course, are making a profit on a scale that they never thought they'd see in their lifetimes. And naturally, they are grateful to their friends on the Hill for ensuring that all this happens. So it's a self-licking ice cream cone, if anything.
Military-industrial complex Eisenhower. Here we go again. It's
on steroids.
On steroids. So much of the, quote, money we are giving Ukraine never goes to Ukraine. It goes to the Pentagon and weapons manufacturers.
But a lot of, keep this in mind, though, when we start talking about the 20 billion or so that's made it to Ukraine, the Ukrainian government is effectively a wholly owned subsidiary now of the American people. We own the government. We pay the workers. We pay the bureaucrats. We're helping to pay for the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian armed forces. We're paying for Zelensky and his government.
Look, we can talk forever, and I know you're the only leader I know calling for peace negotiations. A man of a warfare background, who knows what war is, who knows what a piece of shrapnel looks like in human flesh, probably have seen men blown up in tanks and know what it does to a human body to see a shell fly into a tank and blow people up, or vice versa, what a tank shell can do to people not in a tank. Most of us talk in a vacuum. If we cut a finger, we complain about it for days, and it hurts like hell if we get a splinter. I've tried to tell people to try to imagine what it's like. You have a splinter in your finger and it bothers you for 3 days, and you complain about it and go to a hospital for that sometimes. Do you know what's going on in the world in warfare? We live in alternate universes, Colonel.
It's true.
And then you take a look at the Biden administration. I don't believe that Jake Sullivan was ever in uniform. I don't believe Mr. Blinken was ever in uniform.
I don't think any of them have been. In fact, most of our senior officers on active duty right now do not have the experience of direct fire combat. And that makes a big difference. I don't know who the last chairman of the Joint Chiefs was that did, but I know that General Vesey, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the 1980s, he was one of the last ones who had seen real action, and he was the last remaining officer in his artillery battery in France. Everybody else had been killed. He had very few soldiers left, and he had taken command of this battery as a sergeant and had continued to fire against the advancing German troops. This could have been in the Bulge, I don't remember, but General Vesey, as a result, received a battlefield commission on the spot. I can point to some Israeli officers that are similar, but I don't think we have very many people like that anymore. And I'm sure that makes a difference, because you're right. War is far too terrible to be engaged in lightly. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid there are a lot of people who are very comfortable being armchair strategists and warriors who don't realize the consequences of their actions. And to go back with what you began this broadcast about, World War I, lots of people that didn't understand what they were doing brought us into war.
I noticed today that the Navy announced it lowers entrance exam requirements in bid to get more recruits. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I knew it was bad, but they were looking to, they've raised the maximum enlistment age to age 41 in the Navy. Mm-hmm. And they're going to offer an exemption for up to 20% of its new troops, no exams at all. They were trying to bring in 33,000 new members, and they only got a about 50 people willing to join the Navy. We have a crisis in the military, and it's not a hard thing to understand. When you beat people up for being white, for example, who would want to join such an organization? You're going to put a young kid from the country into the military and tell him he's no good because he's white? Why would anyone join such an organization?
Well, I've said this for many times that nobody understood when they made these decisions for social engineering. You can't promote people and advance people unless they've demonstrated competence and character. If you have a system that rewards people for some racial characteristic, you're in trouble. And the same thing is true on the gender side. You can't bring a bunch of young men ages 18 to 20 into a gymnasium and then tell them that the little 18-year-old girl that weighs 110 pounds can do anything they can do, and therefore she's just as good as they are, because if you tell them that, most of those men will say, fine, then you can do without me, and they will leave. But those are the young men that fight and win. If you don't get them, you're in trouble. And brains, by the way, it matters. Brain power matters a lot. If you take 2 battalions of, say, 600 or 700 troops, you get the average IQ for the 2 battalions. I can guarantee you that in 90% of the cases, the battalion with the higher average IQ will always defeat the dumber battalion. Mm-hmm. It's a fact of life. Smart soldiers are great soldiers. So we ought to be interested in bringing in these young men with brains and character, people who want to be challenged, people who want to fight, people who thrive on the discipline, who want to lead, who want to realize who they really are. They want this gut-wrenching experience of standing up and being successful under adverse conditions. That's what it's all about. If you don't provide that, they're not going to join. And we don't provide it right now.
Michael Savage, a host like no other.
Okay, looking ahead, you are out there in the front. You're running point on calling for a settlement, for peace. Are you alone? Are there any other people of any prominence who share your opinion in the public eye?
Well, I'm sure you're aware that you have Scott Ritter, former Marine major who was heavily involved in arms control in Iraq, and then subsequently, I think, in Russia after the fall of the Soviet state. You also have a former state senator here in Virginia. His name is Dick Black. He's a retired Army colonel who in his early youth served as a Marine rifleman in Vietnam. You have a former intelligence officer, Larry Johnson. Phil Giraldi is another former intelligence officer. They've stood up and said, look, this is dangerous. And, you're right. You mentioned the nuclear weapons. The Russians have made it damn clear that they don't want to use it. But I'll be frank with you. My fear is that if we do commit U.S. troops inside Ukraine, and I think it's still a possibility, unfortunately, that would result in a confrontation that would not go well for us. I mean, right now, I had a friend that's a retired general in the French army. He told me the other day, Doug, we have 4 days of ammunition in the French army.
Oh, my God.
The idea that we would go and fight in Russia is absurd. We don't have the ammunition we once had in storage because we've shipped it to Ukraine. These things have to be understood. When you go to war, you have to have replacements. You rightly point out we can't recruit for the forces we have. And if you go into action with, say, 30, 40,000 people, you'd better have at least 20,000 standing by to provide replacements for the people that get sick or are injured or killed. We don't have it. So where are the repair parts? We haven't even talked about fuel. How much fuel have you got? How far can you get? All of these questions have to be answered.
In the first few months, we kept seeing Zelensky's people showing off how many Russian armored vehicles and tanks they were destroying. Day after day, we saw blown up Russian tanks. Do the Russians still have tanks?
Well, first of all, a lot of those pictures were phonies. What they did is that they painted Russian markings on destroyed Ukrainian vehicles.
Oh, my goodness.
You have to remember that a majority of the equipment that was destroyed was originally Soviet in origin and design. So it's very hard to tell the difference. You just paint the Russian symbol on it and say, well, that's the 1,000th tank or something that we've destroyed. The Russians had in storage when this war began over 8,000 tanks.
8,000.
There is no tank shortage in Russia. Now, today, the Ukrainians probably are lucky to fire 4,000 or 5,000 artillery rounds a day. Up until about a month ago, they were firing 7,000 rounds a day. The Russians have averaged, in terms of artillery fire expenditures, all types and all rounds, 20,000 a day.
A day.
A day. And that figure has been rising, not decreasing. So this is this entire narrative that is just fundamentally false. And when Ukraine ultimately is overrun and destroyed, which I think is going to happen this winter, this narrative is going to collapse. Now, the real problem is when it does, will anyone care? Well, I'm talking about the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And they should care because they've been lied to prolifically. But who has stood up and said very much about the Russian hoax that was directed at the former president?
Yes.
No one. Very few people. And the American people have to become engaged. And I don't think they're truly engaged yet.
Well, there's no draft, so it's not hitting home, number one. We don't connect the rising inflation and the shortage of various supplies, including wheat-based products. We do not connect it with Ukraine. Most Americans can't tie their own shoelaces without the government helping them. They can't connect the two. I'm very worried about the 3 explosions at major Russian air bases, one only 150 miles from Moscow. So to wrap things up, that to me is an escalation. They're using our equipment that we provided Ukraine, allegedly with limitations on the equipment, which I don't believe for 1 second, incidentally. What's to stop the Ukrainians from bombing Moscow?
Well, I would hope the understanding that the consequences that are headed in their direction are so terrible that to do such a thing would make them actually worse than they're already going to be. First of all, I don't know that they were able to reach these targets. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is the possibility of sabotage inside Russia, not by Russians, but by Ukrainian operatives.
Got it.
That someone could drive into the country, set up a launcher and launch unmanned aircraft, what we call drones, effectively the same as a cruise missile, and then just steer it into the target. That's not hard to do. We don't know. And that's why I declined to say, well, it was this, that, or the other thing, because I don't know what systems could have done that. I mean, I know what they are, but I don't know that they've been used. So for Zelensky and his friends, they think this is a big propaganda, win. I'm not sure it is, because the truth is, in the meantime, Ukraine itself is in ruins. And millions of people are on the road trying to get out of the country.
Yeah, I don't see how this gets how this benefits Ukraine. It's not getting better; it's getting worse. And Zelensky can't back off his position because he's never had so much power in his life. He's playing the role of his life. He went from being a perverted comedian to playing Winston Churchill, and it's the most effective role he's ever had. And he's been on the cover of every magazine in the world. He's a hero to most of the West. To me, as one man looking in through a looking glass, I see the Ukrainians escalating, not de-escalating, and they're going to make a fatal error with Russia. I think they're going to provoke Russia in a way that they can't recover from, which would be a disaster for all of Europe, perhaps even the United States. And I don't see any wise men or women standing up like yourself saying enough is enough. Stop the fight before it gets worse. I don't see it. I see it getting worse, Colonel.
Well, the good news is that one of the nuclear plants in Zaporozhye that the Ukrainians have been routinely shelling and trying to damage in order to provoke a crisis has been protected by the Russians. They've prevented anything from happening. There is another nuclear plant that they may encounter when they launch their offensives. But that is something that a lot of us have worried about, the threat of this so-called dirty bomb. We'll see. At this point, though, the handwriting is on the wall. The Ukrainians are not going to win, and the humanitarian impulse should involve an American president saying, we have to come to terms with the Russians. But see, to do that means that you have to admit that you were wrong.
Yes.
You have to admit that you made a mistake. I haven't run into anybody in Washington lately who's prepared to do that. They're much more willing to sacrifice or destroy the lives of millions than admit that they did something wrong.
It sounds like World War I all over again. It's like the movie Paths of Glory in some ways. Same exact narrative being played out in some ways. Of course, there's no direct comparison. Colonel McGregor, I've been anxious to have you back on the Michael Savage podcast. I get emails all the time saying, please have the Colonel back. We know that you have a very large presence on YouTube and elsewhere. You have your own YouTube channel. You appear widely with your positions. And I'm honored that you took the time to be with us today on this podcast. I hope that by the next time we meet, there's some movement towards peace and sanity, but I'm not optimistic. Are you?
No, but there's no reason not to pray.
Well, I do so every night when it's dark at 3 o'clock in the morning.
That's right. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to see you.
Colonel, stay strong. We need you. Appreciate it very much.
Right. Bye-bye.
God bless America. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for listening to today's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something from it. We have about 400 other episodes available for you to listen to absolutely free. You can go back into our vast library of podcasts and listen to any one of them at any time. And remember this, if you want to listen to my podcast ad-free, sign up for the Savage Premium membership and get access to ad-free podcasts as well as some premium content from our Savage archives. How do you sign up for those ad-free podcasts? Please visit michaelsavage.com for a link. Again, thank you for your listenership. This is Michael Savage.